Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience as we've been trying to let people in from the lobby. It's taken a little bit longer than we thought it might do. Just going to wait for a second. I can still see there are a couple of people who are waiting. If there were any problems, Jamie, if you could let me know, that would be great.
Yeah.
Lovely. Welcome everyone. We will make a start now. I really appreciate you giving up your time this evening. We've decided to put on this webinar really a little bit by popular demand. We know that tours can sometimes cause anxiety, mainly I think because everybody wants to do the right thing and to ensure that tours are a positive experience for children and for adults. But we wanted to provide you with some information that will hopefully be useful and point you in the right direction in relation to further advice and support and things that we've got available for you. So really pleased that so many of you were able to brave this evening. We have I don't know, a bigger welcome, I guess, for some of you who might have braved the DBS webinar last week as well, and doing the tour webinar this evening. That's real commitment, so thank you very much. I think looking at the booking information, we've got a variety of people on this course. So we've got some CB officials, we've got RFU staff, some club safeguarding officers, tour managers, coaches, a whole variety. So thank you for joining us. We're really pleased to see so many of you here. We might start off with some introductions, if that's okay. So I'm Viv Rimmer, I'm Head of Safeguarding for the RFU. I have seen many of you before in some of our other training, and I've been around for a little bit. 2018, I think, that I joined, and I'm joined this evening by Jamie and Kath, and I'm going to ask them to come off of mute just to introduce themselves, if that's okay. Jamie, can I start with you? If you can multitask as you're letting people in.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to multitask, getting everyone in. So I'm Jamie, I'm the Safeguarding Quality Assurance and Development Officer. I've been at the RFU for almost a year now, and my role is within the proactive side of the team, so around developing policies, guidance, training, and things like that.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, hi, good evening all. I'm Kath Bennett. I'm the Safeguarding Case Manager at the RFU. I've been here coming up to 11 years, and I oversee the reactive part of our safeguarding responsibility.
Lovely, thanks, Kath. Just really generally, in terms of housekeeping, feel free to use the chat function. Jamie will keep an eye on that. But I'm just conscious that your question may well have been asked previously, so listening rather than typing might be the way to go. And if you find towards the end that we don't seem to have covered the questions that you have, feel free to pop something in chat then, and we're going to pop a Q&A document together, as well as forwarding a recording of this webinar too, assuming that I can bear myself on screen and we think that it's a good idea. If you've got any particular questions or comments, again, just as it says at the bottom, just be respectful when posting stuff in the chat. And we're trying to make sure that, you know, we're doing things in a generic way. We know that some of you have had quite individual questions, and we've tried to answer those in a way that's as generic and useful for everyone as possible. So when we're thinking around the purpose of today and what we're hoping that we've are going to cover, we've tried to take on board the questions that you've asked, and have designed this webinar really around those questions. So again, thank you very much for being so frank and honest in terms of the queries that you've had. There are some clear messages from us and from your CB safeguarding managers too, and we would hope that we'll cover today all of the areas that you would want us to. We will be publishing our new trips, tours and overnight stays guidance next week, and that will go into much more detail than we're able to go into in the kind of 3/4 of an hour that we've got this evening. And hopefully, I think our hope for that, the trips, tours and overnight stays guidance is a bit more comprehensive guide for you. So it has more information than the last tour guidance that we popped together, in the hope that it helps you in terms of thinking around that successful planning of your tour. So let's have a think. It's probably a good idea for us to start off with a little bit around basics. And in terms of what we mean, I guess, regarding a tour. So I've just mentioned that the safeguarding team will be publishing our updated guidance next week, and we've renamed it, rather than tour guidance, trips, tours and overnight stays. And that's really because we recognise that in World Rugby language, a tour involves travelling out of Union, so outside of England, for the purposes of playing rugby. So that might be a trip to Wales or to Scotland or to France or Portugal, wherever it is that you're lucky enough to go. But we recognise in the age grade game that a tour or a match with an overnight stay is very likely to involve travelling from Kent to Surrey or Yorkshire to Oxfordshire, so not out of Union, but it's still going to involve an overnight stay and a trip away from home. And so whilst RFU Regulation 10 reflects World Rugby definition of tour, it's really important that we recognise that things are different, I think, in terms of the age grade game, and that same good safeguarding practice that would be expected of a tour to Belgium is also expected of a trip to Devon. So we're talking about rugby when we're thinking around tours. We are thinking around rugby being away, being played away, I guess. And we certainly need to think about the need for consents, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, and recognise, I guess, sometimes clubs will organise other sorts of trips as well. So it might be an overnight stay that's nothing to do with rugby, or a trip that's nothing to do with rugby. And when we're thinking around the guidance that we've put together, we've tried to make sure that it's reflective of good practice for all of those sorts of events as well. And I guess when we're thinking around that overview, for those of you that have attended any of our safeguarding training of late, you'll be familiar with the idea, I guess, of a whole club culture when it comes to good safeguarding practice. So we talk a lot, don't we, about safeguarding not just being down to the safeguarding lead wandering around with a fluorescent jacket and a clipboard. Well, that being the case when we're in our clubs, and the same is true when we're thinking around tours. So we want all those involved, I guess, in tour planning, and with I guess both the planning and the practice in terms of the practical stuff that goes on when you're on tour as well, to be mindful of, I guess, the tone that they want to set, and to lay out expectations clearly, I guess, to feel confident and supported to challenge behaviours if they're not okay, and to try and manage things early so that if corrections are needed, that they're made, and that things don't escalate. Because I think sometimes when we're thinking around tours and we're thinking around some of the negative behaviours that sometimes we can see an escalation of behaviours, when actually if we were able to address things nice and early, or even put things in place before a tour even starts, then that can be really helpful. Because the bottom line, I guess, is that tours are a really exciting time, and sometimes they're the first or the only time that children have an opportunity to experience a holiday or a trip away, and we want their experience to be a positive one. And we want all adults as well to behave in a way that promotes our core values, and we want it to be an enjoyable experience for those, I guess, for some of you that will be on the course this evening, that have the unenviable task of trying to herd kittens from one place to another, and to try and make sure that everyone feels happy and supported. Is there anything else that you'd want to say around that overview bit, Kath, or are you happy that I've captured everything?
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I think it's really important to consider this webinar this evening in conjunction with reading the new guidance next week. And then if you have any further questions after considering both tonight and the guidance, then to come back to us.
Lovely, thanks, Kath. So one of the issues that came up really quite frequently within the questions that you asked before attending this evening was around consents. And just, I don't want to read out all of the bits that are on the slide, but just to kind of draw your attention to a couple of really key points. Okay, so we're clear, if you're travelling for the purpose of playing rugby outside of England, you will require consent to do so, and in most circumstances that consent will come from your constituent body. So regulation is clear around that in terms of Regulation 10, and that must be followed. But most CBs now will also require you to seek consent for age grade tours or overnight stays that are within England. And so it's really important, you must make contact with your CB in good time to establish what requirements they have. So you need to give yourself an appropriate time to complete the necessary paperwork and to demonstrate that you've made safe and appropriate plans. And that good planning bit is really vital, because what we want to do is to involve early all of those who are going to be involved in the tour, because that's the most important thing, I think, in terms of that planning stage, that sets the tone for that successful trip. And that might be children being involved, because they might be involved in things like fundraising, and it's a great way of helping them to have some ownership too, in terms of the plans that you are making. So again, to be clear, when we're thinking around age grade tours, we've got those tours that are considered under Regulation 10 in terms of out of union tours. And then we've got what we would still consider to be tours or overnight stays or trips with children that are in union, so staying within England. And it's really important that you go to your CB to establish what the requirements are. Most CBs now are asking clubs to seek consent from them, and they've got the authority to be able to do that, regardless of whether or not your tour is leaving England. And just wanted to highlight something just in relation to the consents part, in terms of consents to travel. It's really important that you consider making sure that you've got the necessary consents really to travel. So if parents are travelling overseas, and I'm talking particularly around overseas trips now, if parents are travelling overseas with you, then it's their responsibility to make sure that they're travelling with the written consent of anyone with parental responsibility. And if you're travelling without parents and you are making that step in terms of thinking around an overseas tour that's not going to include all parents in attendance, then you must make sure that you have that. And just to give a bit of context, so some of you might be aware that this is really to try and to ensure that you've got no difficulties when you're crossing borders, and that means when you're leaving the country, and also when you're trying to enter a country, or perhaps, you know, getting Eurostar and you're going to France and then you're travelling over to somewhere else. And the necessity of this is really in response to issues associated with child abduction and child trafficking. So making sure that you have the right consent and that you're travelling with those consents is really important when you're not travelling with parents. If parents are travelling with their own children, then I would suggest it is their responsibility to make sure that they have the consent from all of those with parental responsibility to do so. Anything else that you'd want to say in relation to consent, Kath?
Yeah, there's a couple of things in the chat about issues in relation to the CB, you know, managing expectations of the CB, and whether, for example, the Channel Islands are out of the CB. Can I just ask that you refer back to your CBs to answer those questions? It's not something that we are going to cover tonight. The RFU delegate the responsibility back to CBs in relation to out of union tours. So we would request that you go back to CBs and get those questions answered. There are some issues around consent from parents. Please read the guidance next week that's coming out, because there's going to be some coverage in that, and then please then come back to us if you've got any further questions.
Lovely, thanks, Kath. And our focus today, as Kath said, is really very much on kind of thinking around those safe arrangements for tours, but we can't supersede or override the what's within regulation in terms of out of union tours. And also, as I said, CVs absolutely have that delegated responsibility in terms of being able to ask you for the right paperwork, whether or not that's an in-union tour or an outside of union tour. And I guess we've had quite a lot of questions around checklists and risk assessments and those kind of things. So please have a read through. There is a planning checklist that is included both in the old tour guidance and the new guidance that will be issued next week, which outlines the areas that we're asking you to consider. So please have a read through the checklist and risk assessments thoroughly, and do it in good time. Again, I can't emphasize enough that kind of that good planning is really important. And it's really important as well, because we're thinking around, go back to that previous slide around consents. If you're taking children away and their parents aren't coming with them, parents need to give informed consent. So thinking about what you're doing and detailing that in any event planning is really important. And those checklists and risk assessments are an integral part of the CB consent process too. So if CBs are asking for you to seek consent to go from Sussex down to Cornwall, then part of that consent is likely to be asking you to provide a copy of your risk assessment and potentially checklist. Potentially, I've seen for some CBs they ask for things like court tour, codes of conduct, and that kind of thing. And I guess wanted to raise a couple of things for you that you might want to have a think about. So when we're thinking about risk assessments, it's really important that we remember that some of the activities that you're putting on may not be rugby related. And it's really important as part of that risk assessment and planning that you think about whether or not the people who are supervising, whoever that might be, whether they're qualified. Have you thought about things like weather conditions and what happens in case of injury and the needs of those with disabilities, and whether or not you're planning something that's inclusive? You may have seen on the news recently, there have been issues in relation to other organisations and the supervision of children whilst on things like camps. And a good risk assessment will help you to consider if there are potential risks that you can mitigate. It might potentially make you think twice about some activities if you're not experienced enough to offer them safely. One of the other things that we've been asked about is in relation to ratios. Now, within the safeguarding policy, we kind of detail some of the issues in relation to ratios. You can safely bet that you will need a higher ratio than that would be recommended for normal training and match day scenarios. So deciding on the number of adults that you will need will depend mainly, I guess, on the nature of the activity that's taking place and the age and maturity of the children that are taking part. And our recommendation to you would be that you would mirror that which would be expected in a school environment. And usually within a school environment, they'll say that there should be no less than 1 adult per 8 children. In reality, your risk assessment is likely to identify a greater need. Again, that risk assessment will help you to consider what would be a safe and appropriate arrangement. So I would suggest absolutely that there need to be at least 2 adults present for each activity that you're putting on. So thinking around things like if your tour group are, in addition to playing, they might be going swimming, and you might have some that are swimming and some that are doing tennis and something else. Your numbers in relation to supervising adults will need to reflect that. So it's not all about just the activity that's going on when you're playing a game of rugby. You need to think about the things that are going on outside of that too. And when you're thinking around your tour planning, being clear around what are the responsibilities of those adults who are supervising and coming with their own children, and what activities are being put on, and the responsibility of you as a club, I guess, in terms of thinking around those individual activities and making sure that you've got an assessment that meets those needs. And I guess I would say to remember that for some children, this could be their first trip away from home, and that might be really easy to manage if you've got their own parent that's attending with them. But if they're not attending with their parent, they might be scared or homesick or feeling vulnerable. And the number of supervising adults that you have needs to reflect, I guess, the differing needs of the children that are in attendance. And part of that planning and checklist process and the risk assessment should really have a consideration of that. Is this something that's happened before? Have you got young people who perhaps have attended tours before and have struggled a little bit? Or maybe they are fairly new to the club, and actually this will be a whole new experience with a group of young people that they don't know particularly well either. Kath, what have I missed?
There's some questions about risk assessment and whether parents are attending. We can't give you definitive answers about your risk assessment. The risk assessment is based on where you're going, the age of children, etc. So we're not going to give you definitive answers to your risk assessment. That's the whole point of a risk assessment. You have to assess that risk yourselves. There is a question about if each child has a parent attending, does this affect the need for a risk assessment? No, it doesn't. Risk assessments are essential for your trip that your club is organising. I'll come on to the need for risk assessments further later in my point, in my slide, but parents attending with their own children does not negate the responsibility of the club to have a risk assessment.
Lovely, thanks, Kath. So lots of questions came up in relation to safer recruitment and DBS checks, and I've already given a plug for the Chris's webinar that he did last week, which was great and really well attended. And so I'm not sure if Jamie is going to pop a link to that in the chat. Otherwise, you will get a link, and it's easily findable on YouTube, I think, Chris, isn't it? But in terms of DBS checks, safer recruitment for adults in regulated activity in a tour situation should be no less robust than it is in any other situation, and leaving time for those DBS checks to be completed is really important. But it is also really important to remember that we can't legally ask for a DBS check for someone who's not in regulated activity. And I know that sometimes it is really tempting to say, right, we're just going to DBS check everyone that's coming on tour. Thank you very much. But actually, we're not able to do that. But the way that we've popped it in those three bottom points there. So if the club are facilitating in any way the arrangements for an adult to supervise a child other than their own, they will require a DBS check. So adults attending the tour who only have responsibility for their own child do not need a DBS check. And adults who enter into a private arrangement with another parent to undertake supervision or responsibility for their child do not need a DBS check. That's your general rules. I would suggest that if you have any doubt regarding the duties that someone is undertaking and whether or not this might fall under regulated activity, to please ask us. So in your tour planning, think about the duties that somebody who is attending the tour might be undertaking. So are they likely to be teaching or training or instructing or supervising or caring for children other than their own? Your tour plan that you do right at the very beginning when you're really starting to plan this tour should help you identify if you need additional DBS checked adults to enable you to run the tour safely and positively. So that might go back to some of those activities that we were talking about in terms of risk assessments. So the duties that you are asking somebody to undertake will guide you in relation to whether or not there's a need for a DBS check. And the difference, I guess, one of the main differences to think about on tour is in relation to regulated activity for anyone who's going to be responsible for the supervision other than their own child or as part of a private arrangement between the hours of 2 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning, because that is deemed to be regulated activity, even if they only undertake this activity once. So we'll have examples where clubs, for example, they're all sharing accommodation, and you've got adults who are kind of on duty, if you like, to manage any issues that there might be overnight. That is absolutely deemed to be regulated activity, and any adults who are undertaking that will require a DBS check, even if they're not doing anything else during the day. We have had a question in relation to host families. So when I talk about host family, this is a club, I think, who are organising a trip overseas where rather than organising hotel or other accommodation, a host family is going to be, so one of the team that they are playing, members of the particular club will be staying with that overseas. I think the club was based in France. We have got specific advice in relation to that that we can provide to you if you're thinking about children staying with families overseas. And there needs to be some special consideration, mainly because most other countries don't have the ability to run the equivalent of DBS checks for parents. Their definitions of regulated activity can often be very different. So please get in touch with us directly. And I've been in touch with a particular club who are thinking about doing that this summer already. Kath, what have I missed? Kath's like my little thing on my shoulder, which tells me when I've not said something that I should have done.
Yeah, no, I think we've directed people to the DBS webinar, which I think would be really useful. And I think the slide has answered a lot of the questions that we normally get about whether parents need DBS check-in if they're only looking after their own child. There's one particular question that's come in which is not related to safer recruitment, but it's if the club safeguarding officer deems the proposed trip to be unsuitable or unsafe, who should they inform if the coach is still adamant in attending, or still adamant that the trip should go ahead? You really should, your club in itself, your committee should really have oversight of all tours that your age groups are organising, and should really authorise those relevant tours. So you would want to see the coach themselves assisting in a risk assessment, providing the club with all the tour details, etc. So, you know, clubs need to be empowered to check all their age grade tours, and if the club are not happy with it, then the club probably able to say that it shouldn't go ahead, or there should be some tweaks made. I hope that helps, Natalie.
Lovely. Thanks, Kath. And I would say as well that that's a question that CVs will ask often, whether or not, you know, they are content with the arrangements, and whether or not that's being, you know, the involvement of the club safeguarding officer in terms of making sure those arrangements are safe and appropriate. Thanks, Kath. We had probably fairly predictably quite a lot of questions in relation to alcohol and conduct. And I can't emphasize enough that the purpose of the tour, as it says in capital letters right at the top there, is for a child's benefit and for them to enjoy rugby in a different environment. The welfare of the child is paramount. It's one of the first things we say in our safeguarding policy, and just because we're going on tour, it doesn't make this any less important. And my advice to clubs, I guess, and to adults who are going on tour, is to behave in the same way as they would if they were accompanying children on a school trip. Because I think if this is borne in mind, we're much less likely to see problematic behaviour. So have a think about having a tour code of conduct, and be clear about your expectations right from the start, and feel confident in challenging behaviour that's not okay. And it's great if you can have a code of conduct which calls that out, because it means, again, it's not one person's responsibility to do that, and people are a bit more self-policing, I guess, in terms of thinking around the adults that are there. We have had a question or two in relation to under 18s drinking. And just to be clear, the RFU don't encourage a drinking culture, be that for adults or for children. And clubs should remind everyone who's going on tour of the law in relation to the purchase and consumption of alcohol in the UK. We've had a couple of questions in relation to travelling to a country where the drinking age, I guess, is lower than 18. And we do, I mean, I absolutely appreciate that this can be trickier to manage, particularly when parents are attending and they're responsible for their own children, and where I guess they have free time and they have organised, you know, have free time away, I guess, from organised tour activities. But I would say really clearly that regardless of the licensing conditions abroad and the law abroad, those under the age of 18 are still children. And I'd remind clubs that no adults should be doing anything that places a child at risk of harm, and that includes drinking to excess. So safeguarding concerns in this regard, if they come to our attention, will be managed by the RFU safeguarding team in exactly the same way as incidents that take place in this country. And if we feel that an adult, either by omission or by commission, has placed a child at risk of harm, we will seek advice from statutory agencies. So the boundaries need to be clear. There's a vast difference, isn't there, between a 17-year-old having a glass of beer with their meal and adults allowing or facilitating, even whilst a child, to become so intoxicated that they pose a risk of harm to themselves or to others. And I think I just want to draw attention to something else. So we are really clear that no child should ever be placed in a position where they feel pressured to engage in any activity. And actually, this is clearly what happens at home and what happens on tour as well. And adults need to be mindful, I guess, at all times, to be mindful of the culture that that they are portraying, the culture that we want them to portray. They need to be mindful of peer or other pressures in this regard. And that goes for things like drinking games too. We're really clear, aren't we, that we don't at any point, whether that be home or away, condone drinking games, be that with alcohol or with substitutes for alcohol. We've heard of, lots of different things that are used, not just soft drinks, but, eating things and all of those kind of things. And that culture of kind of glorifying, I guess, that use of alcohol is something that we wouldn't be promoting. Again, Kath, what have I missed?
I think it's an excellent sum up there in relation to alcohol and conduct. But I just want to raise something that Stephen's mentioned about clusters. And we did have some issues last season about clusters that went on tour. And it was evident that there wasn't any risk assessment in place for that tour as a whole, or any lead safeguarding on that. So what I would say, Stephen, is that if you're in a cluster, that you speak to your counterparts in the other club, speak to the person who is organising that tour, and you will need a risk assessment for the whole tour, and that will mean working together with those other clubs and being quite clear as to the responsibilities involved. More than happy to have a further discussion about that. If you want to email us at safeguarding@rfu.com. Clusters are mainly within the girls' age grade game, because obviously insufficient numbers in a club. So you'll get usually 3 clubs who will cluster together in order to form a suitable training or fixture team. And then these clubs themselves will potentially go on tour and play other clubs or other unions. So that's what I mean by clusters.
Perfect. Thanks, Kath. We've had a few questions in relation to insurance, and this is a little bit about me signposting for you, if that's okay. It is really important that you have adequate insurance for the activities that you're undertaking. So that's both playing and anything else that you are doing. So those of us that have been lucky enough to go on holiday and doing things like skiing or anything else, those are the kind of things that you have to declare, aren't they, in terms of insurance, taking part in what might be deemed to be dangerous activity. So make sure that you've got the appropriate insurance that covers not just playing, but the other activities that you are going to be undertaking. We would strongly advise you to seek some advice from Howdens. There's a link there. That link may well be able to go into chat. It's certainly within our guidance. We're hoping actually that we'll be able to share all of these slides with you, so the clickable links you'll be able to click on later. Seeking advice early again is really important. You might want to think about what happens with cancellation insurance, what insurance you are having and organising as a club, and what needs to be organised separately by individuals. Just being really clear around the arrangements so that you can share that with all participants, and they know what the insurance covers and who the insurance covers and what it might not cover is really important. And I am sure that you've had enough of me talking, so I'm going to hand over to Kath for a little bit, just to think about some of the organisational learning that we've had in relation to tours. And Kath, as our safeguarding case manager, has plenty of experience in this area. So over to you, Kath.
Yeah, hi. As the safeguarding case manager responsible for the reactive part of safeguarding, I tend to come into play as such when things haven't actually gone right on the tour. As I said, I've been at the RFU for 11 years. I've been involved myself in rugby club with my own children playing rugby. So I'm familiar with tours from as a tourist point of view, but also as a safeguarding lead at the RFU. When a tour hasn't gone as we've expected, then it's either because people have forgotten the purpose of the tour, as we discussed earlier, or they failed to plan. And as you can see from that first bullet point, failing to plan is planning to fail. It's really essential that you get your house or your club in order early for the planning, for a number of reasons, as Chris alluded to in the chat, for DBS processing, risk assessments, and also as well, you know, from the point of perhaps fundraising for the tour and getting everybody engaged in the planning for the tour. When matters about tours cross my desk, it's because there has been a risk to children because of potential behaviour and conduct, and as we alluded to in earlier slides, we've made mention about alcohol and expected conduct. There's also that potential for the risk to the club's reputation. And also do not forget that when you are on tour, you're representing your club, because you're going to have your club shirts everywhere. People are going to be wearing their tour hoodies, and also you are representing England Rugby. We have had over the years third-party organisations and members of the public contacting us because they've had concerns as regards touring parties' conduct. So what we have said tonight is not something that we have taken lightly or made up, but it is as a result of our experiences over the years and where we have seen things go wrong. So we have provided the guidance and support based on organisational learning. So I hope you do take that away with you, that there is some credibility behind this guidance. In addition to that, as well as RFU organisational learning and providing this guidance, don't forget, if you're planning a tour, don't reinvent the wheel, because no doubt that age group the year previously did that tour or did something similar. So, you know, start talking to other club members, other organisers within your club, and learn from them what went well and what didn't go so well. And that will go a long way to making sure that your rugby tour is fit for purpose. As Viv has already said, that any safeguarding concerns that occur within the tour, they may have to be reported to outside agencies, and we will deal with matters on tour, whether it's within England Rugby Union, any of the home nations, or even abroad, the same way as we would any other safeguarding concern. So please take away from this evening the learning, the guidance, in order to allow your age grade players to have a fantastic experience and have really positive and good memories that will last a lifetime for them. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Kath. And I think that sums it up. We know that rugby tours, you know, they're a long-standing tradition, and the best tours are absolutely the result of committed planning. And the fact that we've had so many of you here this evening, I think is testament to that. Everybody, I'm sure, wants to do the right thing, and so what we're hoping is that some of the guidance that we're putting together really helps facilitate that. So the new trips, tours and overnight stays guidance will be available on the website next week, Tuesday, I think, and we'll be communicating that via the community game update as well. Please have a look and a read through. We're hoping, just a bit of an aside, I guess, so all of the guidance documents that we are either in the process of producing or we have produced recently, we want those to be, I guess, living documents. So we're wanting to update them. So if there are things that you think we really should be including in the guidance that it's not there, or things that you think actually, you know, my reflection having done a tour this year is that this would be really helpful to know, please let us know, because the idea is that we can update those documents regularly. They should be at the end of each of those documents, there will be a date, so you'll know what the latest update was. But we want to be able to use the experience that we have and the experience that you have to be able to try and make sure that we, as Kath said, you know, we don't reinvent the wheel necessarily, that people can learn from what's worked well and what's not worked quite so well. If you've got specific questions in relation to safer recruitment and DBS, please drop us an email. So the DBS EAP email at rfu.com, and general questions in relation to safeguarding on tours, feel free to drop us an email at safeguarding@rfu.com, but have conversations with your CB as well. There is no point talking to another club in a different CB because their requirements might be different. So please have conversations with your CBs and take their advice early. They want to be able to support you as well. We're not trying to spoil or stop anyone's fun.